Thank you for coming, everyone. My name is Damien. I've been a practicing sorcerer for some 30-ish years. Got started through the fantasy novel pipeline, the works of Margaret Weiss in the Dragonlance universe. My first inspiration was actually Rastalin Majra. I was enamored by the idea that magic had rules, was something that you could learn, and I have to confess I was a little bit disappointed when I started branching out into the works of Amber Kay and everyone else being published around that time, to constantly be told that magic was most important to what was inside of you. That it didn't really have rules beyond that, because in my mind, in my heart even, the rules were part of me. I'll call it an aspect of my neurodivergence. Then I discovered Peter Carroll, and through Peter Carroll discovered this gentleman, Austin Spare, where I was very pleased to learn that magic did in fact have rules, albeit abstract ones that didn't necessarily fit the expectations of what most people think of when they talk about the various qualities of colors or stones or herbs or etc. But there is a framework, method to the madness. Austin Spare, while studying him, became something of a hero of mine, and so I'm very glad for the opportunity to present this and introduce you, the ones who are unfamiliar, to his life, his work, and the things that he brought to the field of magic as a whole. His art was, well, as we'll see, very briefly very popular, but a lot of people throughout his life found his work a bit too out there. But he ultimately refused to compromise, which is one of the main things that I very much enjoy about him. As we'll get into here in a few moments, he completely rejected the idea of hierarchy. He absolutely hated dogma and refused to compromise on who he was. The idea of the self was one of the most important things to them. In fact, this is my favorite quote from him. "Not one thing do I know, but that self is inevitable." So, more artwork of his showing just how strange he could be when he wanted to be. So what we're going to be getting into today is I'm going to be giving you guys a very brief biography of Spare so that you can learn a little bit about his life and about where he came from. We are going to be discussing the influences of his earlier life: Theosophy, Spiritism, 19th century occultism, and even some of the art influences that really took him in some interesting directions. We'll discuss sigil magic, his conception of it at least, and a few of my own twists on the idea that I think streamline the process quite a bit. And then we're going to be discussing symbolism's fluidity, which will lead us into the actual alphabet of desire. Have any of you guys ever encountered any version of the alphabet of desire before? As for Spare himself, he might have gone to school to the age of 12. It might have only been 10. It's kind of hard to be certain. Not too long before his time, a law was passed in England requiring or guaranteeing, depending on your perspective, children going to school until at least the age of 10 or 12, depending on exactly what year it happened to be. But he probably would not have been in school very much beyond that. And the education that he would have been given would have been very basic. However, despite all of that, he was enrolled at the Lambeth School of Art at 15. And this is an interesting thing to note because his father, as you can see, was a policeman, and we know absolutely nothing about his mother's background. A working class girl who lived near the river is about our best guess as to where she came from. Not to say she wasn't anyone important, but, well, no one important, and his father walked a beat until he retired. So he did not come from money, he did not come from opportunity, and yet at the age of 15 he was able to be enrolled in the Lambeth School of Art, possibly as a result of a mentor who would have vouched for him, signed off on his quality and potential as an artist. And as a side note, Spare later claimed that he was first introduced to magic and occultism from a figure known as Mrs. Patterson, who is, he described as being very, very old. We cannot find any sign of this person as she might, or as someone who existed in his life, but we also do have kind of the negative space where there might have been a very early age mentor that secured his direction in life. At the Lambeth School of Art is when he first probably encountered the ideas of theosophy. Possibly before that, but with the socialization in the art world, or in art schools at the time, this would be the most likely place where he would have started branching out and really encountering some of these esoteric ideas. After 2 years at Lambeth, he was featured as Exhibit 1359 in the summer exhibition of the Royal Academy of Art. That's the Royal Academy of Art, not the Royal College of Art, because apparently mixing them up is something a lot of people do, even me, while I was doing the research for this quite a bit. So I'll be reminding myself of the difference while giving this talk. He's the youngest artist to be exhibited at the time, and actually for quite some time after that. There is apparently a special separate exhibit for children, very young artists. But Spare at 17 was for the next 20 years, I think, the youngest person to be exhibited before his record was eventually broken. This led directly to his enrollment at the Royal College of Art, and that's the Royal College, not the Royal Academy, in 1905. This was a very interesting period in his life because he hated it. He was much happier at Lambeth and probably would have been much happier at the Royal Academy, whereas the Royal College, the stuff that he was doing was, for his own artistic experience, extremely remedial. They were still working off of inert, inanimate models, while Spare was already drawing directly from life. And he also felt, as did a lot of his fellow students, that this remedial work was hurting their potential career opportunities as artists, because most of what they were going to be drawing was going to be portraits and things like that. This probably led him, more than anything else, to reject hierarchies, to have people who thought they were in control tell him how it was supposed to be, instead of discussing what he would actually have needed to do. This also led him to reject the idea of intellectual spirituality. One of his key points moving forward was that spirituality, spirituality and mysticism were something that had to be experienced. You could not understand it just from reading books. And that led him to encounter this. And by the way, this is not necessarily the most accurate symbol of theosophy out there, but I decided not to use that one for reasons that you'll quickly realize if you try to Google it. What we do have about theosophy, for those unfamiliar with it, is it draws heavily from Neoplatonism, Hinduism, and Buddhism. A lot of Eastern texts and Eastern philosophies were used as the foundational practice of theosophy, most notably the idea of the One, sort of a God figure. Its primary goal was to be the formation of a single global fellowship of humanity. Theosophy, as a rule, did not ascribe to any particular doctrine, at least officially, nor did it rule any doctrines out, at least officially. So long as you were willing to work towards the formation of a global human fellowship, then you could be considered a theosophist if you wanted to be. Another idea that the theosophists held onto was the idea of the hidden masters, these ascended or elevated intelligences or consciousnesses that perhaps once were people, but have since left this plane of existence behind, and then throughout history would choose receptacles for their wisdom to try to guide humanity in whatever direction it needed to for its overall spiritual betterment and the formation of that global fellowship. Primarily based on the writings of Helena Blavatsky, who's something of a controversial figure even during her life, and more so in the years that follow. Spare also encountered the idea of spiritism, which believed in the persistence of the soul beyond death as an active agent. They did not believe in an afterlife. According to them, when you died, all that really happened was your spirit shrugged off your mortal meat suit and then continued to be an active agent in the world. Communication with the dead was not only possible, but unavoidable. The soul also continues to evolve after death. The person that you are when you die is not the person that you will be 10 years after you die. Influences in the world, based on how many people communicate with you, how you're forced to communicate with other people, your general feelings about the state of the world continue to influence how you develop as a person. Literally, the only thing that changed was no more meat suit. Another interesting thing about Spiritism is they were largely obsessed with scientific approaches. They were the ones who really tripled down on the idea that with enough beeping machines and wires connected and enough smart people signing off on their ideas that they could get some kind of scientific validity. I like to think that at least part of it was using the scientific method to try to understand what actually happened, what was actually going on when they did their seances and communicated with their spirits, but largely it was more the quest for legitimacy more than anything else. Interesting thing about Spiritism, though, is the idea of spiritual healing and energy work as we know it today came directly from their work in the ground that they broke. It is true that in the East, the ideas of theosophy being one of the pipelines for that, there are systems of energy work that predate what the Spiritists do. But when we talk about the energy in the room, or the energy of this thing or that thing, we are largely referring to the work of the Spiritists directly. Another interesting thing about them, and more relevant to Spare himself, is they developed automatic writing as a technique. When you talk about automatic writing and automatic drawing and things like that, this is work, again, that they broke the ground for. And now the symbolist movement. We're going to be revisiting the other two here previously, or the other two previously mentioned, because Spare rejected both of them wholeheartedly. This one, though, I have nothing bad to say about it. Spare absolutely adored it. In fact, one of his personal heroes was a major figure in the symbolist movement. The thing about the symbolists is they have criticized and rejected objective representation. And what that generally means is, sorry, Freud was right, a cigar should not ever just be a cigar. If you use something in your work, there should be a reason for it. When you make jokes about college students in literature class going on and on about, well, when the writer did this, I feel they were trying to say this. That is what the symbolists as a movement stood for. To them, the idea was everything. A chair could just be a chair, but that would make it a very poor chair indeed, because a chair could represent rest, or it could represent submission if another person nearby was standing, or it could represent discomfort if it was a particularly uncomfortable chair. The idea is that it's not the chair, it's the idea of the chair that is most important in the art. They also rejected the decadent, which is a very interesting thing to say if you were to look up any examples of symbolist art, because they were all over the place. As we'll see here in a moment, sexual imagery, gore, occult imagery, demons, etc., things that we would consider depictions of the decadent. But a word that I like to use, and probably should have used here, would be rejection of the gratuitous. Because again, the whole point was that if you were depicting something in your art, there should be a deeper meaning and a deeper reason behind it. It makes no sense to show a gory, badly damaged body unless you're making a statement with it. Aubrey Beardsley, that hero of spares that I mentioned, and actually someone he was compared to quite a lot, especially in his earlier years. I didn't include any examples of his art, but I recommend Googling him and checking out some of his stuff. It's fantastic. Also, William Horton and Isabel de Stager are major names in the symbolist movement as well. And you will find a lot of early occultists and esotericists in that movement as well. But even among the non-occultists, as mentioned, you see a lot of esoteric themes, demons, angels, depictions of sorcery. Very fond of mixing religion with the macabre and other fringe ideas. And like I said, this was the major influence that Spare did not wind up rejecting out of hand. So a lot of his ideas, a lot of the things in his art and in his magic largely came from the symbolist movement. And now back to theosophy, because as mentioned, Spare rejected them. He hated the ideas of them and wanted nothing to do with them. Theosophy in particular, even though, as mentioned, officially Theosophy did not adhere to or even reject any particular doctrine or dogma, they had an almost exclusive focus on the work of Blavatsky herself. So anyone who criticized Blavatsky's work was shunned. This led to the formation of a de facto dogma where you had to pay attention to Blavatsky or you weren't doing it right. Note on Blavatsky, as mentioned, she was a bit of a controversial figure. During her life, I don't remember the gentleman's name, but someone actually published a list of all of the books and texts and scrolls and etc. that Blavatsky directly plagiarized her work from. Somehow, whether or not she plagiarized her work is still a conversation today. I would have expected that to be a nail in the coffin, but things happen, I suppose. Also, those hidden masters that I mentioned. It's a common criticism amongst organized religion that the people in charge get to interpret the will of God as it speaks to them, and that often winds up, coincidentally, of course, being in their best interest, not yours. The same thing would happen with Blavatsky's hidden masters. The people who were elevated enough to receive their learnings got to then transmit those wisdoms and those commands to the people underneath them, leading to a rigid and very suspicious hierarchy. Also, Theosophy focused on an intellectual understanding, which, as mentioned, Spare absolutely rejected. Experience is everything. You can read about something and that's all well and good, but unless you're doing it, you're not doing it. This makes special sense as an artist because you can read about art, but unless you actually practice the drawing, you're not going to be a very good artist. Also, Theosophy was very much based on Victorian ethics and the Victorian worldview, even despite the Eastern influences. And we're just going to breeze through this because if I get distracted talking about all of the things wrong with the Victorian worldview, I will be keeping you guys well over the schedule. Back to the Spiritists now. The sensational nature of seances opened the door to innumerable frauds and hoaxes. One of my favorite details is the mediums who would swallow cheesecloth that had been soaked in cornstarch and water so that at an appropriate time they could induce vomiting and have ectoplasm to puke all over the table. Also worth noting that one of the earliest foundational people associated with the Spiritist movement was actually revealed to be a hoax. Also, shifts in scientific belief undermined the supposedly empirical reality of Spiritism's works. What this looked like is they wound up plugging up those wires and beeping machines and getting those smart people involved and realized that maybe 90%, 95% of the people that they were poking around with were full of absolute crap. And even the remaining 5% that made them go, that's weird, didn't really provide them much of anything except to go, that's weird about. So shifting scientific viewpoints were a problem for Spiritism. Also, this was actively condemned by the Catholic Church, Protestant culture, even other groups like Theosophy, all for different reasons, but nobody really liked the Spiritists that much. Anyone who knows anything about Harry Houdini will know exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. More interesting and more to point is they were criticized as being too passive by both Spare and everyone's favorite Aleister Crowley. The thing about Aleister Crowley is he was very much about taking reality by the horns and making it do what you needed it to do. Spare, who did not so much believe in an external reality but an internal one, was also all about grabbing your subconscious by the horns and making it do what you wanted it to do. The Spiritists, on the other hand, would just sit there at their seance tables and let the supposed or actual spirits call the shots. Also, they were too very focused on spirit guides, this idea that there were spiritual mediums or mediators. Intermediaries, that's the word, sorry. But there were spiritual intermediaries that had to help them make contact with the other side, and Spare in particular was all about doing something himself if it needed to be done. And then there's this asshole. Mr. Crowley discovered Spare following a 1907 exhibition at the Bruton Gallery, which, by the way, was one of the very last exhibitions by the Bruton Gallery until relatively modern times. It was shut down soon after. Following their introduction in 1907, Crowley commissioned Spare to create art for his Equinox magazine. This was the magazine that was being put out as part of the creation of the Astrum Argenteum, or AA. He did publish 4 commissions in Volume 1, Number 2, not the actual inaugural issue, but pretty close to it. Invited that same year by Crowley personally to join the AA, more than likely as an additional bit of acknowledgement for the work that he had done. Like I said, this was back when the AA was in its initial stages of being formed. So it was probably Crowley just trying to get anyone vaguely interesting or interested on board. Spare didn't do well here either. Once again, rigid hierarchy, both administratively and spiritually. Lots of rules, lots of dogma. He was not very comfortable. An artist cannot understand organization, or he would have passed. Crowley's actual words regarding Spare. Ultimately, yeah, Spare had no real interest. It had the same problems as Theosophy. It had the same general attitude as the stuff that he encountered at the Royal College. And so by 1909, he was checked out. This was less than a year, more or less, after he first joined as a probationary member. And by 1913, as indicated, he was no longer a member. Even by that point, though, he had essentially left behind to focus on his own work. The Zolski Occultist, by the way, this is another picture drawn by Spare, actually a self-portrait. Earth Inferno is a fascinating book. If you know where to look, you can find it free online. It's just a collection of his art and some poems and some of his favorite quotes. A lot of it's pretty fascinating. He first published it in 1905 when he was still at the RCA, probably a reaction to the publicity following his exhibition at the Royal Academy. This was not a man who was very comfortable with things like that. This is also the first signs of his later philosophy. You see Kia mentioned, and we'll get into exactly what Kia is here in a few seconds. But this is the first mention of it, the first mention of Zos. Rever the Kia, and your mind will become tranquil. Also a quote from Earth Inferno. And that leads us into his magnum opus, Book of Pleasure, Self-Love, which is both exactly and nothing like what it sounds like it should be with that title. This is where we actually get sigils and the idea of open-hand sorcery. Speaking of sigils, these are some of Spare's actual work. Spare believed reality was formed by the tension between the Zos, which was individual existence, and the Kia. Your Zos is the totality of your individual existence as mentioned. It is your body, it is your mind, it is your subconscious, it is also your superego or higher self. It is every aspect of the universe that makes you an individual part of it. Kia, by contrast, is the formless everything that exists to unite all of the instances of Zos that exist. Everything here, for example, all of you, arguably, from an animist perspective, even the chairs, the floor, the concept of the room itself, are all individual iterations of Zos. The thing that binds us together and makes this a here that we all share, that would be the Kia. Magic works best when the Kia is allowed to handle things. That was ultimately what Spare believed. Sigils in the ecstatic state are used to bypass the Zos, which includes the subconscious, and deliver desire directly into the Kia. The idea is our minds get in the way of a lot. The idea that he had was you have a desire, you abstract it, and then you scrub it from your mind. And in the act of manifesting it as an abstraction, while scrubbing it from your mind, you let it fade back into the universal Kia, which then manifests the desire on its own. Sigils must be forgotten for best results. If you're thinking about it, it's still part of your Zos, and the Kia can't work with it. You see this similar idea talked about when people mention psychic sensors or subconscious interference, things like that. The idea is if it's still part of your Kia, or if it's still part of your Zos, the Kia can't work with it. Desire arises in the Zos, beginning in the subconscious. Like I said, subconscious is a vital part of that Zos, and that is where everything we want begins. Sigilization transforms that desire into a glyph, obscuring it from the conscious mind. If you can get to the desire before it really becomes manifest in the consciousness, before you have a chance to obsess about it or worry about it, then you have a much better chance of being able to scrub it from your Zos and let the Kia manifest it. Oops. Through ecstatic trance, that basically ejection, not rejection, but ejection of the desire away from the Zos, the sigil dissolves back into the Kia where manifestation then occurs. The Kia then manifests through desire, through mysterious means. Spare didn't really think too much about that for reasons that make sense within his own worldview. Desire, taken to its utmost, absolute subconscious obsession, sublimated and forgotten, abstracted and ejected from the Zos, becomes the truth, the manifestation of Kia. More of Spare's art. It's so cool. This is where Spare and I differ. I believe in the idea of noumena. Noumena is a Roman concept that describes the experience of profound reality or the profound experience of reality, depending on how you want to spin it. Anyone who has ever stood there and watched a thunderstorm come at them from across the ocean knows exactly what I'm talking about. If you've ever been to a waterfall, something the size of Niagara, you know what I'm talking about. If you've ever seen a tornado with your own eyes, or even a shuttle launch, or anything like that, stood on top of a mountain and looked out over the world, or stood at the bottom of a mountain and looked up. When you feel small without feeling small in the face of some massive, inexorable reality, then you have experienced noumena. My belief is that if you can access that noumena, then you don't need to scrub the sigil or your desire from your Zos. Noumena are not gods, nor spirits, nor thoughts. They are presences felt, known, and experienced as sacred. They do not require explanation. They do not speak. They are the certainty behind the mystery. We talk a lot about mystery in spiritual and esoteric pursuits. One of the biggest counter arguments is that there is no mystery here, it's just reality. But anyone who has ever stood and experienced noumena directly knows that there is a reality behind the mystery to wonder about, to wonder at the scale of and the nature of. To create a noumena is to consecrate reality itself. A properly consecrated sigil becomes numinous, not a symbol of magic, but a manifestation of it. My belief is you don't need to worry about forgetting what your sigil means, or worry about, oh crap, I remembered what this sigil is for. Does that mean it's not going to work now? If you can learn or get yourself to view that sigil with the same sort of awe with which, for example, a proper Catholic would view the crucifix. When you walk into a church and you feel that experience. If you can learn to program yourself to view your sigils the same way, then you're 90% of the way there to the manifestation already. And now we're going to do a little bit of hands-on experience for those of you unfamiliar with sigils, or just as on the course to learning more about the alphabet of desire. The first step is to take a statement, remove duplicate letters, which we won't need to do here, combine the shapes of the remaining letters into a glyph, clean up the resulting glyph into something both simple and mentally interesting, and then set the sigil aside to be empowered. I'm suggesting we use I learn. And this is another place where Spare and I differ. He liked to form his sigils based on the phrase, it is my will, or I will the desire, to will it into existence. I don't think this is necessary. If you always start your statements of intent with the same words, all of your sigils are going to look the same after a while. Also, this is more direct and more applicable. It's not my will to learn something right now in this class, in this weekend. It is ultimately my will to improve my ability to learn in general. So, I learn. Also, this works. We don't need to worry about deleting any repeating letters. And the example of it, and if you guys want to create your own sigils while I'm demonstrating this, we can start with an I. And then if I give myself an L here, because you can see the L, that also gives me the E. Then I can give myself the A, the R, and the N. Does everyone follow along with that? Exactly how that worked? Step 2 is to clean it up. And what you can see is up there in the top right, you have a circle, and then those straight lines emanating from or pointing to the center become the other important aspect. So we can play with that and come up with something like this. So after you've created your first iteration of I learn, you can make it this, just to make it more mentally interesting. Now, Spare would suggest taking it one step farther than that, and I actually encourage it. From this, you would create a drawing, a piece of art that incorporated this general shape and could be empowered with this general idea so that you had something even more mentally stimulating to look at. Originally, I wasn't going to show you guys what I did, but with the insistence of my fiance, I decided to risk intimidating you all with my epic art skills. And yes, the Met is already trying to get into a bidding war to get this in their gallery. The idea that I came up with was, it looked a little bit like a person flying with a wing, an angel, if you will. So with about 10 minutes, I created this. Yes, it is very cringe, even to me, especially to me, to be honest, but it gets the job done. And in making this, in understanding that this is now a representation of, if I let my mind wander, an angel of learning, then even the cringe can become part of the noumena and empower the sigil even farther. And that leads us in to touch base real quick on the alphabet of desire. This is actually Spare's alphabet of desire, or an example of it, and this is actually the only example that survived. See, in During the Blitz of London, a bomb fell in through the roof of Spare's apartment while he was hiding in a bomb shelter, and 80, maybe even 90% of everything that he owned was blown apart. All of his artwork that he had, all of his journals, all of his notes, everything was lost. This was a major blow for him, and I think it's worth noting that this probably goes a long way towards explaining the actions of his later life and why he never really did amount to anything after that. Because this would be the second time that he got wrapped up in a world war and suffered greatly for it. Now, the alphabet of desire, as mentioned, is the core language of symbols. It exists universally, but has specific iterations for each individual. Potentially, the origin of written language as a whole. Also, ultimately, the intersection between internal and external reality. And the point here is to be able to look at a symbol and know what it means with absolute certainty. And what all of this means is that the idea of the alphabet of desire is universal. Everything has one. Everything that has any sort of perception, any sort of internal understanding of the world, at least in theory, has an alphabet of desire. But mine are going to be completely different than any other person's. Yours different than anyone else's, etc. And once again, the ultimate point is to be able to look at this symbol and know what it means. This is something that I actually teach my students when teaching them to read tarot or to interpret their dreams. Throw the books out the window, because the most important part of this divination or this interpretation is the person doing the divining or the interpreting. Look at a card, and what is the first thing that catches your eye, and without thinking about it too much, what does that mean to you? As an example, who here recognizes this guy? You've never seen him before?
Is that a gnome of some kind?
For those of you who do recognize him, who knows where he came from?
Coca-Cola, right?
Point. It actually is a little more complicated than that, but very good. Because this dude actually is based on, I can't really see it, St. Nicholas of Myra, who, as a Catholic individual, was famous for being very fond of children, but not in the way that normally comes up when you're talking about Catholic individuals. He did a lot of other weird stuff in his life, but that wound up being his greatest legacy for many years after his death. How kind he was to children, how much he did to take care of them. St. Nicholas eventually became Sinterklaas, by way of Saint Nicholas, which further shortened to Sinterklaas, primarily in the Scandinavian regions. And that eventually became Santa Claus. The reindeer were added in the mid-early 1800s, along with a willow branch to spank children and a black servant to carry them off. Unfortunately, I am not kidding. Check out Black Pete. Fortunately, that aspect of the lore did not last very long. In 1910, L. Frank Baum actually intervened, got rid of the servant and the willow branch, when he published The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus, establishing much of the modern lore, which did not originally include flying reindeer, but reindeer who could jump in a flight-like manner, very similar to the very, very early Superman. And then the Coca-Cola story that everybody knows. In 1931, Hagen Sundblom, that's a name for you, creates the rotund jolly man we all recognize today, based on his personal friend Lou Prentice. So literally every depiction of Santa Claus that you see is a drawing of Lou Prentice. Next question. Who knows what this is?
Chaos magic.
Do you know how old this symbol is?
Depending upon what variation of it, pretty old.
How about this one specifically?
Oh, I don't. Specific.
20 years.
Yeah.
This was created in the 1960s by Michael Moorcock.
Yeah.
Not popularized until the very early 70s with his Elric stories. based on the idea of an 8-point, or the 8 directions, not just north, south, east, west, but also the northeast, the southwest, etc., to encompass the ultimate potential of facing every direction. Later adopted by Warhammer, Dungeons & Dragons, and only later than that did it become to represent the occult concepts, primarily chaos magic, which, by the way, was also based on Moorcock's decision, or depictions. So he's sort of like the godfather of chaos magic. Now it is arguably more recognizable than any similar design, including the compass rose. Most of these other 8-point stars, you have to be very closely associated with the context in which they're used to recognize it as something else. And now here's a really hard one. Who can tell me what this is and where it came from?
The pentagram.
Mm-hmm. Any idea where it came from, what it means, how old it is?
At least going back to Plato. But I believe that there are pentagram depictions on Egyptian tombs as well.
This was originally a proto-cuneiform symbol meaning corner or angle. Supposedly, it was also variously used as the Star of Ishtar, but I could not actually find any reliable sources proving that.
It's also similar to the symbol for the duat
Yeah.
in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was also the symbol of mathematical perfection in ancient Greece. The Pythagoreans loved this. And while we're at it, it was also a symbol of Jerusalem in the later 1st millennium BC. And it's an old Christian symbol of the 5 wounds of Christ. Didn't become associated with occultism until Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa in the 16th century. So the use of this as a religious symbol or a symbol of magic is only about 500 years old, or around it. So now that we've gone through all of that, I'm going to show you guys a couple of concepts, and I want you guys to picture the very first thing that comes into your mind. What do you think of when you think of the sun? What sort of symbol? What immediately pops to mind?
Circle with rays coming up.
Something like this? How about the moon?
Crescent.
Something like that? The whole point of the past couple of slides here have been about the idea that symbols shouldn't necessarily be accepted at face value. Just because you know what a symbol means doesn't necessarily mean you know what the symbol means to everyone else. Pentagram in particular is far older than most people recognize, and for most of its history did not mean what it means today. Santa Claus also has a particularly strange history that really went into left field in a couple of places. With all of that said, there are commonalities, and we should not be afraid necessarily to reach out to other people symbolically. The sun and the moon that I'm sure everyone here thought of is exactly what I came up with once again, my absolutely amazing art skills. Now for some weird ones. What do you think of when you think of safety? What symbol comes to your mind?
Yellow caution thing.
Home.
For me, it was a house. Shelter of the roof, the shelter of the 4 walls. If I am in a place, a building that I can call my own, I'm safe. Anything that's happening outside, whether it's weather, whether it's danger, if I can get someplace inside that's secure, I can have a pretty good chance of being safe. What about control?
The chain.
Mine's a wheel, like the kind that you would find on a ship. A stylized steering wheel, if you like.
That's funny, I thought of a car steering wheel on the top of my head.
Yeah, there are differences, there are still commonalities.
Yeah.
Now for a really abstract one, where we have thought. Go ahead and show you mine.
The bubble.
You mean something like that? You can see this, I really meant it as kind of a vague head shape with a thought bubble coming out, but also a lamp emitting smoke that would reveal things also fits. How about change?
I always use the
Two arrows.
triangle symbol that's like from math, but.
That is
theta.
that is entertainingly close to what I got, which does have the triangle symbol, but is a seesaw. Now here's a really hard one, but one that's really important. How about self? What symbol would fit if you were to think of me, I? Because I came up with this guy. Human figure with the ever-present asterisk floating roughly where the head should be.
Question,
Yeah.
what do you think about symbols that are already in use? Like for instance, you talk about self, and then you said the word I, and it made me think of the symbol for the sun, which is a circle with a dot in the middle, and not only does the sun symbolize yourself, but it's also kind of like an eye. But it's already used, you know, in astrology, for instance. So, you know, are you suggesting that we try to make something that is not really mainstream, or is that not really?
It doesn't matter so much as you might think. As we did with the sun and the moon slides here, pretty much everyone was in agreement. And this is what a sun means, or this is what would mean sun, this is what would mean moon. Your subconscious, your internal language can be influenced by the world around you. If you dream of something that references a modern concept, someone 500 years ago might have essentially the same dream, but would have to spell out the symbols using concepts native to their time. So if your alphabet of desire were to reflect at least partially the things around you that mean certain things, the caution triangle, for example, that's perfectly valid and encouraged even. It's whatever provides the shortest path between what you want to say and how you can best symbolize that. We also have learning as a concept, which, by the way, for me, was this guy. A slightly less vague head shape with arrows pointing towards the thought activity.
Big book.
I think of an apple. That knowledge.
And so now we're back where we started. I learn. Based on this, my revised sigil, not using Spare's original method, but just going straight from the alphabet of desire, wound up looking like this. It's that asterisk of thought, or that asterisk of self, receiving the information. You might try a sun wheel with a book, or a circle around an apple, or anything like that based on your own internal alphabet of desire. This, by the way, and you can combine the techniques as well. Use the letter method to generate the idea, and then mix and match with AOD symbols, which is what gave me that. Which I then, following Spare's original course, I turned into another epic drawing. Not to intimidate anyone again with my amazing art skills. And this was all based on this original sigil idea. And now that we're here, I am going to hand out this, which will have a list of concepts, a starting place for your own alphabet of desire. And I would very much like to hear your thoughts on the concepts, if there's anything that you would find absolutely useless, or anything you would particularly like to add. Because the other thing important to the idea of the alphabet of desire is, what is important to you? There can be a concept that I might find absolutely vital that somebody else would find completely pointless.
My one question looking at this is, it's like pairs of opposites, so is that two different ones, or is that supposed to be in the same one?
Yes. You could make these symbols reflect an actual duality. I edited them that way just because it would save space.
You remind me of the kind of concepts that are in the runes. Yeah.
The method that I like to use to teach people to channel their own alphabet of desire is actually based on a technique that one of my mentors used to help their students create a personal symbol of runes. Because that's pretty much what you're doing. You're taking the time to find out exactly what kinds of concepts are important to you. And like I said, I handed out the list just as a starting point. And once you have the list of things that are important to you, you, with a quick snap association game, come up with a symbol that speaks to you. And that's sort of the important thing, because you don't necessarily just want to go on impulse, but you do want to reflect that deepest connection and that shortest distance between concept and depiction. I also recommend doing this kind of work in trance states.
I was just going to ask you, so I have essentially a sigillic alphabet that I've developed, and my entire practice is largely built around a lot of it. And a lot of that has been done through, like, initially, like, automatic writing, automatic drawing, and scrying techniques and things like that. But I was going to ask you if automatic drawing or automatic writing plays a role in your practice.
Automatic writing, not so much, but automatic drawing does. In fact, I was very excited to learn a new toy for sigil generation yesterday in Sarah's ink block class. Because you would write out your statement of intent, your desire, and then when you fold the paper and spread out the ink, the first thing that you see would reflect a connection to the concepts that you started with.
Cool.
Then just build art around that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, scrying does work also. Go into a light trance state and just focus on the concept and then externalize that concept. You can use that to make a connection with whatever kind of depiction would make the most sense. The automatic drawing, as mentioned. Sparrow actually was a very big fan of that. In fact, he's one of the earliest sources that I can find to turn automatic writing into automatic drawing. And a lot of his later art started that way.
Some cool stuff.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that any of Spare's art, the art that he left behind, is actually like maybe a message from him?
Message, no. But I could say that almost all of it, at least after a certain point, definitely had some kind of magical intention behind it.
Yeah. My experience with reading his work, because his work is very interesting to read also, is that it's literally, in reading it, it's alive with magic, and you can see the influence, particularly on folks like Chumley and things like that, with the idea of the living word and the transmission of magic through the use of words. So it's not just the words on the page; they're infused with magic, and I feel like his art and writing is very that in a lot of ways.
Definitely, it harkens back to what I was saying in the beginning about the symbolist movement.
Yeah.
Where everything has a point, has a deeper meaning, a deeper level. It is a wasted effort to depict something that only has that one level if you could accomplish 3 or 4 things with the same amount of effort. So to answer your question, I don't necessarily think a message per se, with the exception of the writing, but with the art, there's definitely a lot of magic behind it. Just about every picture that we still have of him, especially from his later years, probably had some kind of magical intent behind it. Yeah. Any other questions from you guys? Okay. Then I think I finished significantly ahead of schedule. Sorry about that. But yeah, this has been my discussion of Austin's Bear and his Alphabet of Desire. What I very much encourage you guys to do is, if you like trance states, if you like automatic drawing, sit down with that list that I handed out. Take about 10 or 15 different concepts, however it makes sense for you to take them. Mix and match with your own ideas, things that are very important to you and that you would absolutely need to be able to depict in your magic. And just see what you can come up with as far as symbols or depictions. The idea is to go as deep as you can to access them.
Excellent, thank you.
I think I'm gonna do Vine Runes because, Ivor, Dominguez, he wrote this, one of the books he wrote, he was talking about vine glyphs, like putting astrological symbols together, kinda like they do with Vine Runes. So, I think that this is a good approach, like kinda combining those things, like picking out what's important to you and also using that system, so.
And like I said, you can definitely mix and match. It's always going to be a good idea to talk to your own inner self, your own subconscious, to find out what its core symbols are. But when it comes to actually depicting those on the outside, you can mix and match across everything.
Right.